On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with Christian mystic Albert LaChance and religion scholar Rebecca Goodwin about their new book, The Third Covenant.
But the point is, I think we're all trying to wrestle with this, and I'm not quite satisfied with the, we can just transcend it just by saying, here's the third covenant, here's the book, here's the way, here's how to do it. No, we live in a world that confronts us with all these absurdities and contradictions all the time. So the contradiction between the different departments at Harvard is a reality. We can't just transcend that by saying, okay, I choose to kind of move beyond it. We can, but then when we're sick, we're going to head back to the doctor. We're constantly trying to balance these things. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that's a reality that we have to, I guess, face in a more direct way. That this bridging, this transcending, this unifying isn't as easy as it sounds.
But it can't happen cognitively. It has to happen experientially. So it's a categorical error to think that we can do this with the cognitive brain. We can't do this with the cognitive brain, which underscores exactly what you're saying. We can only do it with what I call the fourth voice.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, we're going to return to the topic of Christianity and spirituality with some very progressive-minded Christians and the author of a very interesting new book. So this dialogue I was able to have with Albert LaChance and Rebecca Goodwin is quite far-reaching. We talk about a number of topics in addition to this idea of experience and when experience matters and how we resolve experience with science. We also get into the historical Jesus versus Christ consciousness, something I think is key to understanding and really trying to penetrate as we try and get our hands on what this extended spiritual consciousness is all about. We also dive into talking about revelatory truth versus objective data and so much more about spirituality and science and their intersection, a topic that I am very interested in, and I know you are too, because you tell me you are when I do these shows that I love so much. So without any more, here's my dialogue with Albert LaChance and Rebecca Goodwin. Today we welcome Albert LaChance and Rebecca LaChance Goodwin to Skeptiko to talk about a new book they've co-authored titled The Third Covenant, a book that seeks to offer a new and unique bridge between the gap of science and Christianity and offer a new way of looking at religion, ecology, and the big picture questions we talk so much about in terms of who we are and what we are, our place in the world. So, Albert, Rebecca, welcome to Skeptiko. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex.
Happy to be here.
So we've had a really nice, invigorating email exchange prior to this interview, and there's a lot of great topics that I hope we have time to get into, but I think we should start with a little bit of the basics, background. Albert, do you want to tell folks a little bit about your fascinating, interesting, rich background, and then specifically how you came to write this book with your daughter, Rebecca?
Okay, well, first of all, it's important that the subtitle of the book be put right out there, so it's not seen as another Jesus book with 4 E's to it, you know what I mean? It's understood to be a larger and a paradigmatic shift toward something completely new, and it's not just new in the sense of comparative religion, but in integration of all the traditions as a single global tradition. So, the subtitle of the book is The Transmission of Consciousness in the Work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, and Albert LaChance. And the reason that I see it now as a single tradition I mean, it's obvious to me that there are many people who think, write, and read about Teilhard and about Thomas Berry. But what I've seen is because of the note to the reader and the peculiar experience that was, which followed upon a vision from 1972 that I never much talked about, but now seems more important to me as the years go on. That vision, the first vision, was a cosmic Star of David that happened after I read, because of insomnia in 1972, I read an essay by Teilhard de Chardin called How I Believe. And following the reading, I fell back onto my bed in the pre-dawn light, and my ceiling opened to the cosmos, and I can't explain that other than the fact that space, whether it's outer space, inner space, or the space between atoms and molecules, is the same space. And the ceiling opened to me, and I could see the Star of David, two triangles breaking into a different symbol, which is joined, the two triangles joined at their bases. And what I saw there was the emergence of the universe that Teilhard had called Christ Alpha, the development of the universe along this long diamond-shaped projected, and then lastly Christ Omega, the fulfillment or completion of the universe. I was caught up in the vision. I was in my 20s, and what happened was I got scared. I wasn't prepared spiritually for what was going on, and I shut it down, and I couldn't get it back, but I never forgot it. Mm-hmm. And so I continued to look for that kind of spirituality in a Western as well as Eastern context. And I came across the work of Sri Aurobindo. I came across the work of Daisaku Ikeda. And I've been reading Buddhism for all these years, too, from 1972. So I was looking for the next piece, the next way in which I could make this my own. And it happened on February 8th, 1984, with the 2-year-old Rebecca sitting on my lap, when this guy came out to speak in California. It was in the Bay Area, and it was Thomas Berry. And by the time his talk was done, I was holding her and sobbing, and I simply asked him to study, if I could study with him, when we're both on the East Coast. And he already knew who I was, but I didn't know that. And he said, "Yes, you can, Albert." And we went off from there, 1984, to a 6-year study. And Becky was brought up with this whole understanding of what he calls a new story as a basis for faith, a basis for life, a basis for living. And so now she studied and has continued to develop this whole idea until it was obvious to me that it was time for us to join forces and get her vision out there, because at this point I'm 67 and it's time to pass it on. So I'll pass it on now to her and let her continue the story.
Yeah, I think if I were to describe how I came to the point that I came to work on the book, it was really almost as if I had the paradigm from childhood onward and I had to do the work to fill in the framework underneath it. I can't seem to sort of think outside of the vision that's laid out in this book, because it is simply how I've always seen the world. And all the way along, I was curious about it and, very familiar with Thomas Berry's work in particular. I didn't study any de Chardin until I came to college, and then my dad gave me that same essay, How I Believe, and I began reading that as well and his work from there. And so all the way along, I've worked very closely with my dad, mainly, like I said, out of my own curiosity for the work, and I've been in the background on each of his books. He will be the first to tell you he's a complete technophobe and will not use a computer. So I've actually, since 16 years old, I have typed all of his books, including his 800-page doctoral thesis. So I've had sort of a background view of all of his ideas as they developed, even before they were written down. We would sit in the living room, even when I was as young as 12 or 13, talking about ideas and watching them unfold. And I've just been captivated by all of it. And it took me through college. I took, twice as many religious studies courses as I needed for my major. I just couldn't get enough of it. I went on to a master's degree, again, sort of filling in that framework so that the picture would keep getting deeper and bigger and richer. And the Third Covenant came about as a result of numerous conversations that we had had. And, Dad, his work is so rich and so complex that I sometimes think people struggle to get to, exactly what he's saying. And I thought that my very first contribution that I could do to honor this legacy would be to take his work and to make it as easily understood as possible so that a wider audience could be receptive to the ideas, because I feel they're so important.
Wonderful.
I'm reminded of a statement that Woody Allen made in his movie Love and Death. He said, somebody should translate T.S. Eliot's poetry into English. So
Right.
It's kind of like that.
That was Rebecca's job. And we should mention, Rebecca, that your master's that you're talking about was from the Harvard School of Divinity. Quite an accomplishment, so we got to get that in there. Rebecca, in the introduction to the Third Covenant, you talk about the purpose of the book in your introduction, and you say, shifting away from polarized thinking and fundamentalism and towards an integrated understanding of who we are, and I like this, what we must become. Kind of a very broad, bold kind of statement. What are you, tell us more about what you're thinking there.
Well, you mentioned Harvard, and I think one of the greatest gifts that I was given at that university is a view of, whether you want to call it the divine or God, Yahweh, Allah, a view of the divine that is enormous in its breadth. And I think too often individuals sort of, and I think I'm prone to it. I do identify as a Christian, and it's easy to sort of become over specialized in how we view the divine. And I think in the way that our technology, in the way that our culture and our community globally is ever moving in the direction of unity, spiritually speaking, we're still so divided. And, a huge gift of being at Harvard is being able to interact with people from every faith and finding that common ground. And my hope is that, as technologically we become more connected, economically we become more connected as a global community, that is the direction we will also head spiritually. And, my dad is fist pumping in the background here because I know he agrees with me. So that's sort of the vision that I hold dearly. And I think that the book, if I were to have a great hope for what the book could be, it would be to provide a roadmap for that future, one where we are less divided spiritually and more aware of where we agree rather than where we disagree.
Well, let's talk about that, because what I'd like to do in this interview, and really I think I want to make it more of a dialogue between us, because this is a topic that in various forms I've touched on so many times, and I feel this burning desire to dig into some of these issues that seem to linger and never get resolved. And I think with you two occupying this wonderfully spiritually open but yet grounded kind of middle ground of being, hey, spiritual but Christian and inclusive, progressive in all those ways, there's a lot of touchdowns. Here's where I'd like to start that integration of your book, The Third Covenant, and some of my investigations on Skeptiko, and you can help straighten me out, if you will. So let's start.
Go ahead.
Let's start with consciousness. You write in The Third Covenant, whether or not we can measure consciousness or even know what it is, we know experimentally that it is. Well, gosh, you could have saved me about 3 years worth of research right there, because I know that, you know that, but I've had, I can't tell you how many interviews with Ivy League scholars, some of the leading quote unquote consciousness researchers in the world, who would object to that and would hold on to this moronic idea that you are a biological robot, that you're experiencing only the illusion of consciousness. And even though I agree with you that that has been experimentally falsified, as well as being just kind of dumb from a philosophical standpoint, that is still the dominant scientific paradigm. So pull that apart for me a little bit and tell me what you're thinking when you say that.
First of all, I just finished reading perhaps among certainly one of the greatest essays I have ever read in a book that was published in New Delhi called Concepts of Space, Ancient and Modern. This particular one, it was from a conference that was held there a number of years ago. This particular essay was from Ramon Panikar. Have you ever come across anything by him?
No, I haven't, but I've noted that essay and I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah, it is the kind of essay that is efficacious in the sacramental sense, and that it creates what it signifies, that as you read it, you become aware of the depth and the truth of it in your own being experientially as you're reading it. And what he was talking about, he too obviously, he's a Hindu in the same way that I'm a Catholic, but I really don't even call myself Christian anymore. I call myself a disciple of Yeshua, because first of all, it's his real name, and that's who I really am, because Christianity, and I think he's found popular Hinduism to be pretty disappointing, and so I think he would probably be comfortable with being called a disciple of Krishna in the same way that I think of myself as a disciple of Yeshua. So that's a long introduction to answering your question. What he was writing about is the notion of space itself, that when we take the Western viewpoint, the consciousness is a product of the brain, and we balance that out against the concept in the understanding in the East as the brain is a function of consciousness. It's the other way around. Then we get in touch with what Teilhard meant by Christ Alpha, what Thomas Berry meant by ultimate mystery, and what I mean by originating mystery, that prior to matter, prior to energy, prior to the fireball, consciousness is. And so you could call consciousness being. We know that being is, because here we are, the three of us who are being, and your audience is being, and they'll be with us when they hear this. So we know somewhere in us because we are it, not because we can measure it, not because we can prove it in the sense that 1 and 1 are 2, but that we know it because we are it. And when we come across it in a form like Panikar's essay, we just know it's true. And there is no defense of it. It can't be defended in the way you would say 1 and 1 are 2, where you take two objects, you set them down and say, okay, now it's 2. It's not like that. So he pulls in the whole notion of sunyata, the concept in Buddhism and Hinduism of emptying, so that when we empty and empty and empty ourselves of various identities, we wind up in touch with what I call the monosacred, that consciousness is what everyone has considered sacredness. And it's not a scientific word. It's not caught in that. It's not caught in that paradigm. So when we look at the various traditions, be they Chinese, Indian, indigenous, Middle Eastern, we can recognize that the fundamental truth of human culture is the experience of the sacred. That is different from monotheism. Monosacredness is the recognition of mind in Buddhism, of Brahman in Hinduism, of Tao in both Taoism and Confucius, in Wakantanka, the Manitou, whatever it might be in the native traditions globally. Humans have always sought an experience of the sacred. So there is a monosacredness present in all of culture, and that is what we can call consciousness. Consciousness is whatever it is. Here's where Alcoholics Anonymous comes in too. God as we understand God, well, it comes to the same thing. As we experience sacredness, we understand that there is sacredness in all traditions, including science at the quantum level.
Hold on, Albert, because I'm with you, but I want to back that up a little bit and make a couple of points and bring it
Go
back
ahead.
to this issue of consciousness.
Yes,
First,
I was done anyway.
okay, well, good. I don't mean to interrupt you. It's so rich, it's so deep, and we can go off in a million ways. I want to come back to consciousness, though. First, you talked a little bit about we cannot prove the existence of consciousness. And I guess I'd kind of take issue with that a little bit, because I think what we can do and have done is falsify the idea that mind equals brain, that your brain generates consciousness. And there's some great experiments that have been done on this. And one of the ones that I point to a lot of times is the work of Jeffrey Shorts at UCLA, who's shown experimentally that self-directed neuroplasticity, what he's really talking about is mindfulness meditation, but we won't tell anyone that. But these people meditate and their brain changes. Brains aren't supposed to do that if brains are just this robotic function. They don't work like that. Certainly near-death experience completely falsifies this idea that mind equals brain, because here you don't have a functioning brain in the sense that we think about it. So there's some good experimental data out there that overwhelmingly falsifies the idea that mind equals brain and establishes all those great points you were making about consciousness, and I agree with. That's point one. But here's point two that I think really gets to the heart of this book. And Rebecca, I think this is the point that you were, I think, leading up to, but I'd like to hear more of what you think about it. And that's we're talking about a bridge to science. It's a bridge to nowhere, because science is stuck. Science as we know it is stuck, is built fundamentally on this idea that we can measure things, because you are in here and the world is out there, stuck in the idea that mind equals brain. It is part and parcel to the scientific paradigm that we know. So when we talk about bridging to science, bridging spirituality and science, bridging spirituality and our culture as it exists, what are we bridging to? It's a bridge to nowhere.
Well, I guess I would be hesitant to say that completely. Only because I think, first of all, let me agree with you on one point, and I think both science and spirituality suffers from the same tendency towards false dualities. So, spirituality, or religion, I should say, maybe perhaps more than spirituality. Religion is more apt to say, I am right and you are wrong. And I think science is more apt to fall into the same trap, that something is, quote, true because it can be experimentally proven or, supported, and then therefore something else must be not true. Whereas when we look at the quantum level, we know that many of the things that we have held to be true, when science broke through to the quantum level, we suddenly discovered that that was no longer quote unquote true, that truth as science had claimed it to be did not exist at the quantum level. And, I think consciousness in a spiritual sense transcends all of the boundaries between religions in the same way that the quantum world transcends many of the boundaries within science in the way that we understood it before we made that leap. So I think there are areas of science where there is an openness, in the same way that there are many areas in religion that represent an openness, and that is where the bridge will have to take place. But I think more than maybe bridging the two communities, and again, I think once again we're falling into the trap of saying we have religion here and science there, and both Teilhard and Berry were trying to illustrate a union between the two, that consciousness transcends both, and that where we live, where we function, this was the thought I was having a moment ago as well. I remember hearing a lot in Berry's work about a functional cosmology, that in order for something to work, it has to be functional. And getting caught up in, trying to disprove the presence of consciousness, and clinging to the sort of, brain-driven reality that you were describing, as much science does, I think it's not functional for the average person. and it doesn't reflect reality.
Hold on, wait a minute, but it's functional for science. I can't let us slide past this point. At Harvard there, you might have said that over in the School of Divinity, but if you walked over to the School of Medicine, or if you walked over into the Department of Psychology or the Department of Neuroscience, they would have had a strenuous disagreement with you on that fundamental point. So they wouldn't have seen any kind of unification. They would have just said, you're flat out wrong. Look, we can put this probe in your brain here and you do this. Therefore, mind equals brain. So I don't know that we can gloss over that. Do you think we can? I mean, unify is great as an idea, but how?
That's what the third covenant is. The third covenant is the bridge. That's what it is. It's leaving behind the whole dialogue, literally dialogue, the two, even the dialogue between science and religion is itself transcended. It's left behind, and that's why it's a third covenant. It's a different way of perceiving in the Western world that will give us a lens that transcends the argument or even the effort to do it. It is the bridge. That's the point. So Teilhard and Tom and my own efforts and Becky's efforts at integrating this for the human to be a lived spirituality, that is the bridge. So for us, or at least for me, speaking for myself, to be pushed into that dialogue with let's say I'm going to see a neurosurgeon this afternoon because I've hurt my back, all right? And if he starts, with that whole thing, that whole mechanistic treatment of me, I will never see him again.
But Albert, that's a great point. You are walking in. We need both. I think this is what people struggle with. You are going to the neurosurgeon. You are going to someone. You're going to the belly of the beast there.
I'm going for an evaluation, but my evaluation of him will determine whether or not, in other words, if he is an automaton, if he's living according to that particular worldview, he can't heal me because that's not what I am. I am consciousness in this material form that he's working on. And if he can't meet me in my that's the whole work of Eckhart Tolle, the whole notion that we're not just the form identity. That's what Buddhism is in a nutshell, that we're not the form identity. We're that which dwells within it and manifests the form identity. And any medical person who treats me that way, I leave behind. That's why I like chiropractic. They've treated me since I was 22 because they've transcended that. And how did they transcend it? They transcended through consciousness. The work of the first Palmer, I forget his name, C.J. Palmer, he claimed that there is an innate intelligence in the cosmos, and that's what does the healing. Well, we cannot define that because we are it. It's not possible to give a kind of formulaic description of it when we, in fact, are it. And that is what the third covenant represents. It's not Christianity in its next phase. It's a whole different view of the issue itself in an attempt to bridge it.
Okay, since you brought up the Christian angle, let's move on and talk about Christianity, because I think it's an important part of this. And I guess, well, let me back up and say, what I'm, pushing on is the real day-to-day skirmishes, battles that go on among all of us to balance these ideas, to balance the world that we live in. You're going to the doctor, you're going to the neuroscientist, the neurosurgeon, because ultimately, you're going to try everything you can to maintain your health. I, recently wrote about my experience with having a medical condition. In my case, I had heart palpitations, and I didn't know what to do. And I went to the doctor, and like you, I was very dissatisfied with the way, the ideas, the treatment and all this. And I said, screw this, I'm going to go do energy healing. I went and did energy healing and dietary change because of Skeptiko and this guy named Dr. William Bankston, who's did this amazing research, scientific research on energy healing. I became convinced that there's something to it. I tried it, and it was efficacious, as the physicians and researchers like to say. But the point is, I think we're all trying to wrestle with this. And I'm not quite satisfied with the, oh, well, we can just transcend it just by saying, oh, here's the third covenant, here's the book, here's the way, here's how to do it. No, we live in a world that confronts us with all these absurdities and contradictions all the time. So the contradiction between the different departments at Harvard is a reality. We can't just transcend that by saying, okay, I choose to kind of move beyond it. We can, but then when we're sick, we're going to head back to the doctor. We're constantly trying to balance these things. I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that's a reality that we have to, I guess, face in a more direct way. That this bridging, this transcending, this unifying isn't as easy as it sounds.
But it can't happen cognitively. It has to happen experientially. So it's a categorical error to think that we can do this with the cognitive brain. We can't do this with the cognitive brain, which underscores exactly what you're saying. We can only do it with what I call the fourth voice. And neuroscience has come to that. I think of a book, in fact, you might want to really get in touch with this guy and interview him. His name is Joseph Chilton Pearce, Pearce, and it's called
The Biology of Transcendence.
The Biology of Transcendence. And it's one of those books where I got to the last page, I went back to the first page and read it immediately again. And I still had my radio show, I would have done whatever I could do to get him into the studio even in order to be able to talk about it. There is another methodology, and without that methodology, and it is mindfulness, it is meditation, it's the scientific pole of this futile argument between science and spirituality would hold that those interventions aren't real. Well, they are real. They are real. And as soon as we see it, we can't unsee it ever again. It's what Becky said in the beginning, that once you see it, there's no way back from being, and that's what awakening is. So it's a question of a category of research, and the research is an interior research through meditation, through prayer, taken seriously, not as some cheap piety, not as, Jesus is going to do this for me. Not that, but a nakedness, an emptying as we face the cosmos and going on the revealed truth that is presented in that category. And that is where quantum mechanics is at. So most of the scientists, what's his name? Albert Einstein. Albert is his name. Albert Einstein once said, the only conflict between, and this is in his book, Out of My Later Years, he says, the only conflict between science and spirituality is by those who don't know any better. That's simple. It's a matter of spiritual ignorance to think that we can understand something that is ultimately non-logical. It's not illogical, but it's non-logical. It's experiential. And it is consciousness. And once we're there, we say, oh, this is what they meant. This is what they all meant. But convincing anyone else of that is a futile attempt. The only thing you can do is share your experience. That's a great wisdom of the addiction programs. You share your experience, strength, and hope, and the other person either discovers it or they don't. But there is no final definition cognitively that will do. It's a fourth voice, what I call the fourth voice methodology. It's not cognition, it's not affect, and it's not instinct.
Becky, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with what he was just saying, and I think, I sort of walk that line in my work. I work for an institutional church, so I kind of have one foot in the very nitty-gritty church life, and then the other foot in this very broad, very progressive vision that I'm hoping to bring to fruition in whatever small way I can. be part of it. But I think, I had this idea as Dad was speaking of, when you have an injury and you're going through life and suddenly, I broke my toe, for example, this summer, and I suddenly realized exactly how much I used my toe once it was broken. My awareness was brought to my toe all day, every day for the 6 to 8 weeks that it took to heal. And I think bringing a certain level of awareness to the ideas that we're bringing forth in this book into my daily life, into each individual's daily life, in very specific ways. I don't mean to be vague here. In the book, for example, I talk about the book Cultural Addiction that my dad wrote, which provides a methodology similar to what's laid out in a 12-step program for unpacking the interior and doing the very practical work that brings awareness into these ideas so that we're functioning consciously in each aspect of our life. So when we're sitting in the doctor's office, these ideas are there, they're present, and they're conscious. When we're in dialogue with our friends and family, when we're worshiping in a church or temple or mosque, it's there, it's conscious, it's brought into our awareness. And so by our shift in orientation to the rest of the world, the world hasn't changed yet, but we have changed. Our orientation has now changed. And that affects each aspect of how we function in the world around us, in our community. And I think what Dad's point was that it's experiential. It's not cognitive. The only way we can get it done is by doing it ourselves and then hoping that, the next person comes along, we share our experience and we help them. And I don't think there will be a top-down approach where it's like, okay, we have the answer now, here it is, let's do it. It's much, it's a bottom-up. It's each person being willing to do the interior work and then bringing the fruits of that interior work into their daily life.
Oh, you two. I have much, much more faith in science than you do. Let me tell you a story about something that I experienced. I've done a lot of interviews and shows on near-death experience science because I think it's the most concrete scientific way that people can wrap their arms around the reality of these spiritually transformative experiences and also the idea that you survive death, that you are more than your brain, more than this biological meat sack that you are. So I've done a lot of shows. Top researchers in the world. Most of these people have never had a near-death experience. They've just researched it clinically in other people and hospitals and this and that. I have also, in the last couple of months, interviewed people who've had distinctly Christian interpretations of their near-death experience. One guy had on this scripture-quoting preacher named Ian McCormick. So Ian comes on and says, hey, I experienced Jesus. I experienced Christ consciousness. Great. You experienced Christ consciousness. Wonderful. And here's what he says. Start saying the Bible. Start saying, Lucifer, if you don't experience it the way that I did, could be Lucifer, could be Satan, could be deceived. Only through Christ, only through Jesus. We can laugh, but it's not a laughing matter. He's serious. And that is his experience. And that experience is trumped because it was an experience that we can medically say came at a time when he wasn't supposed to have any experience. And he further says that he has shared this experience with thousands of Christians who have shared similar experiences. And I have to tell you, in the research I've done in near-death experience, it is unquestionable that many, many people have experienced Jesus, Christ consciousness, in this altered state, in this state where they don't have any brain. But what the researchers will tell you is when they carefully look at experience in the way that I think we have to look at experience, not by just this, hey, what was your experience? Did it share? Did it resonate with me? But by saying, what are some of the standards we use in science? The guy I point to a lot of times is Dr. Jeff Long, radiologist in Louisiana, compiled the most comprehensive near-death experience survey, 150 questions, medically sound. The guy's a doctor. He knows how to do this. It's medical science. That's how science gets much of the starting point for its research is through surveys. You go out and ask people, what happened to this, happened to this, happened, and then we start seeing patterns. Well, that's what Jeff Long did. What is his conclusion? The primacy of Christianity falls apart. There's a bunch of different people from different traditions that have different experiences. So this experiential part falls up. It has to be looked at very carefully with a very skeptical view. Otherwise, we would immediately go to someone's experience and take it at face value. In this case, we can't even take Ian's experience at face value. We have to really deconstruct it in a way that I think would kind of totally go against what you're saying. We have to really go to Ian's experience and say, okay, you saw Jesus. We accept that. But what does that mean? What does the scripture mean? What does all that mean? And we have to integrate that with all the other things we know in terms of the historical records of the Bible, what scripture quoting means, the archaeological records that are being turned over at every shovel that's in the Holy Lands now. So does experience really trump this kind of scientific investigation that we can do to find out what's really going on?
Do you think we're arguing against that? Because you haven't understood the argument. If you think anything you just said is perfectly acceptable to me as a methodology, but ultimately what you accept as true is comes from an experiential dimension of yourself. I'm not saying, well, I felt the presence of Jesus and therefore I know I'm loved and I know I'm safe and, I'm redeemed. That's not what we're talking about here.
Wait, Albert, let me just interject and then I'll let you talk because I talked for a long time. I don't mean to denigrate that spiritual experience. When the ceiling in your room opened up and you saw the Star of David, I accept that. I just want to go past that and understand what that might mean. Similarly, I accept that Ian saw Jesus and Jesus quoted scripture to him. I think we have to dig deeper, though, and say, what does that mean? And I think that's where the journey begins. That's
the third covenant. I mean, really, I know you think that I'm just an author who's defending his own book. I'm really not. What I'm saying is everything that you're saying is exactly, either you haven't read it deeply enough or enough of it, but there is no argument with science. None. I've been studying science since I met Thomas Berry in 1984. Our whole 6 years face to face was science, cosmology, ecology, biology, anthropology, archaeology. It was all science. The whole thing.
But Albert, you're not hearing what I'm saying. I'm saying the bridge to science doesn't work because science is stuck in this other paradigm. So
well, you done telling me you have more faith in science than I do. I don't think you do. I think we're probably both on the same journey.
I think we are both on the same journey. So if I'm overemphasizing the points of kind of disagreement or conflict, what I'm really trying to do is get to that next level of conversation because I hear this stuff all the time, this kind of flowery talk about unifying religions, unifying with science, and then I get down to the nuts and bolts of it, and I just don't see it happening. I've talked to the neuroscience. They have no interest in unifying with you. I've talked to Ian McCormick and his scripture quoting near-death experiences. They have no interest in unifying with your, he would call it, a new agey religious ideas.
Yeah, so would I. I would call it that myself. But, there are other scientists. There's Rupert Sheldrake, and there's Carl Jung, and there's, a slew of other scientists who came to a different conclusion because of the experiential truth that they came in touch with through their research. Precisely through their research, it opened the door or the portal to an understanding that was unitive. And by understanding that they could no longer, because their very research brought them to that, they bumped into what I'm calling the third covenant. There are people everywhere saying there's this big new consciousness that's coming, and, we're all going to be part in the confusion now and the destruction of the planet and all of that is leading up to it. And what I'm saying is that that's true. There is a consciousness coming, and it's coming in all traditions, and part of it is by a different lens on the traditions. But boy, the idea that there would be even a conflict between the deep truth of science, it's one universe. That's why it's a uni and not a multiverse. It's a universe, and if we study it physically, we're going to ultimately come to quantum mechanics. If we study it spiritually, we're going to ultimately come to the same conclusion, that there is no break in the fabric of the cosmos from the fireball to the present. And in fact, this conversation with the three of us and the people who will listen to it is itself part of that awakening. And I'm just calling it the third covenant because I was told to in the letter to the reader. I never had that idea. I never planned a book called the third covenant. That was something that happened to pull all this together.
And I also want to throw in, too, that I think the reason why Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry's work is so significant in this unfolding idea, and exactly what we're talking about right now, is that they both represent people who were scientists and spiritual men. That Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a scientist first and a priest, and that he reconciled the two worlds for himself and discovered ultimately that they were not two worlds, they were one, and that Thomas Berry himself, a cultural anthropologist and a lover of science, as my dad said, he probably has as many science books in his house as he does theological ones. I know because every time I'm here, I'm sent home with yet another milk crate full of books that I absolutely must read. So I think those two people are just two examples of many, many, many minds who have made that transcendence. And so I think it is possible. It's just, I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And I'm certainly not so naive to think that, it's going to be as easy as flipping a switch. There is great tension there, as you've pointed out and as you've discovered in the interviews that you've done. But I would not say that it's futile. I think there is great promise, and it's emerging.
Well, and I really want to, I'm going to be brief because I know I went on just before her, but I would call things New Age too. I despise that whole thing. Quantum mechanics comes up with the idea that human intention can't be divorced from the process that we're observing. And the next thing you know is, we create our entire lives, which is really true, but done in this kind of, I don't know how to describe it other than a Pharisaic way, a kind of, aren't I special? I see this and you don't, or something. There is nothing, everything that I have written and everything that I have studied is grounded on sound research. It's not a bunch of flaky, wild and groovy stuff. It's all real solid stuff. And I came to the conclusion that is now called the third covenant because it was given to me to come to that. And I believe that the new consciousness, and I know how arrogant this must sound, but it's true. I believe that the third covenant is what we're waiting for. We're waiting to have a methodology in order to come to a new level of understanding of what makes us one species, one planet, one solar system, one galaxy, one cosmos expanding, and that it's all sacred, and that consciousness precedes it and consciousness succeeds it. That is all consciousness in material and energetic form. I would agree with people using that, the New Age, pejoratively. I feel the same way. I feel it's flaky and it's too facile.
I don't know. I think the New Age gets a bad rap. I think it was a major turning point in consciousness raising, consciousness changing. But let's not go there. Let's talk about religion, because I have with me a self-identified Christian and a self-identified disciple of not Jesus.
Yeshua.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeshua. So let's talk about religion, because it's also a topic I've explored pretty deeply in this show. And when I start with the Bible and start deconstructing and looking for the history, the whole thing unravels pretty quickly.
Yes.
As you know. So what are we to make of the reality, the history of Jesus? And we can say that doesn't matter. I don't believe that matters in terms of one's ability to tap into Christ consciousness, because that's what the evidence tells me. Getting back to your point about experiential, I'm not approaching this from an experiential standpoint. I'm just going and following the data the best I can, and the data that I'm that I follow says people can experience Christ consciousness. It just seems to be out there. It seems to be true. I don't know what that means or how they do it, but it's true. So what are we to make of the fact that the reality of a historical Jesus is very flimsy, very hard to really figure out? It all unravels, and yet we can understand that people do have this experience with Christ consciousness. And don't we need to understand that history a little bit better before we say, like I said at the beginning of this, that, oh, it doesn't matter because you can still experience Christ consciousness right now? I mean, we have to know what we're saying doesn't matter, and that what we're saying doesn't matter is the history. That was a convoluted statement, but maybe you got the idea.
Well, the reason it unravels is because you're running evolution backward. That there is an evolution to the movement of Abraham from Ur and the settling in Israel and the emergence of the various phases of the Hebrew unfolding, which led to the emergence of this renegade prophet and rabbi called Yeshua. And then he left for a few of his buddies some understanding of it, and from there it unfolds until the 4th century, 325 or whatever it was, the Edict of Milan, where it becomes an imperial religion called Christianity. It was never called Christianity, first of all, by the Jews. It was called the people of the way. And the first time the word Christian was even used was in the 1st or 2nd century in Bithynia, which is part of Turkey now, or part of an ancient name for a particular piece of Turkey, and they were called Christians, and that's where that whole thing emerged. So then the church becomes imperial, and you have the unfolding of a certain magnificence, especially when we think of Tridentine Christianity, this unfolding, the magnificence of these consciousness frozen in stone that we call cathedrals, and the sculpture and all of the stuff that emerged. I mean, this has its own magnificence, and it has its own value, but at the center of it all is an Eastern teacher, a Middle Eastern teacher who experienced divinity in his own being. And is he still present? Well, of course he's still present, because the cosmos is still present, and he realized his unitive experience with the cosmos, that he and the cosmos were one. He called it Father. But if you run it backwards, it simply has to unravel, because evolution in the time developmental universe, things move forward. Not
well, maybe
linearly.
we're using the word unravel in a different way. I mean, what you talked about, hitting the high points, I think I probably agree with, but there's a lot of controversy there in terms of who was Jesus, who was this breakaway group, what was their relationship to the Jewish tradition that was occupying Jerusalem at the time. Did Jesus even exist in its form? And then we have to deal with did Jesus really exist as a human being, or were they always talking about Christ consciousness? I was brought up in the Greek Orthodox tradition, although I don't consider myself a Christian now. There's many in the Greek Orthodox tradition, in that Eastern tradition, that go back that always saw Jesus as this Christ consciousness being, never saw him as a human manifestation of it. So for question number one, does the history matter? Should we be not talking about Christ consciousness, but talking about the Nag Hammadi library and what we know about Jesus and what we know about that imperial religion? And my buddy Joseph Atwell, who wrote Caesar's Messiah and does a wonderful job of showing the literary parallels between the historical accounts of the Roman historians and how that worked its way into the Bible. So does the history matter? Does that need to be the starting point?
Well, I'd like to address, I want to turn this over to Becky to answer this question, but I want to ask you a personal question, and it's not a challenge or anything. It's just a legitimate question. Have you ever considered your search? I mean, what you're doing right now with us and the other authors and people that you've interviewed and studied, work with, read, all of them. Have you ever considered that as an extension of your Orthodox baptism, in the same way that a Jew would experience the freedom to, look at what they call them, Bujus, those who become Buddhists in different traditions from the East, all of which I love and find to be true. Have you ever considered that in a time developmental universe, what you're doing at this very moment is your baptism, is your predisposition to truth, is your search that is leading to the third covenant, to the next expression of this Middle Eastern triad that has been ruthlessly nasty to most of the earth, certainly the native people, certainly the other members of its own triad. You are searching, and that search, I would say, is what your baptism actually is as an Orthodox Christian. And I'll give this over to Becky now.
Okay. I mean, as far as, just let me interject, that's all fine and good. My job here is to poke people. So that's all I'm doing. What I think my own spirituality has to remain kind of behind the veil. I'm with you. I hear you. I'm okay with what you're saying, but Becky, please take over.
Sure. I mean, what I was going to say a minute ago is that I think you asked the question, is the history important? And I think in a cultural sense, yes. I think part of what we can do that no other species can do is that we can step back and examine our own history, understand our own culture, find the value, find common ground. That's all well and good. And, obviously being at Harvard where biblical scholarship is, at the height of what's going on in the world, and the very, very brightest minds were there, and I loved it. I loved uncovering the historical Jesus. I took a lot of classes looking to recontextualize the person Jesus in his Eastern context. And when I wrote when Dad was writing The Way of Christ, which was the book that preceded the Third Covenant, I wrote an introduction entitled The Eastern Reformation, the idea that the next phase of Christianity will have to integrate an Eastern worldview, because Jesus, after all, was not from the West. He was an Eastern person. So I think there is value in the history to the extent that we understand the story. Thomas Berry said, the first words he said at that talk that my dad mentioned earlier when I was with him at 2 years old was, it's all a matter of story. That, story is important. And so to the extent that the history helps give us context, it's absolutely valuable. However, I think what is equally, if not more valuable, is whatever piece transcends the story. And I think that's what you're sort of getting at with Christ consciousness is, in the end, the identification, that I feel with Christianity transcends that history. It is not of primary import for the work that we're doing and what we see the Third Covenant being in the future, that it is one that transcends history and culture. But, that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be there. I hope that answers your question anyway.
Well, I think it raises the same dilemma for me that we faced with science. And again, guys, we are so much on the same page here and coming at this in so much the same, in terms of the Third Covenant, all that. I mean, maybe not strictly in terms of the way you've laid it out in the Third Covenant. But again, my job, my mission is to provoke and probe. And I guess my job really is to ask the questions of those who are not converted, are skeptical. I'm skeptical. We're all skeptical, but in a good way. I'm willing to be convinced. I'm willing to be won over by the power of ideas, but I need to be convinced. So here was my problem with science, right?
In other words, you need to experience it as truth. That's what convincing is, isn't it?
Well, maybe, but we already had that discussion. We already had that discussion in terms of I'm very untrusting of my experience, right? Because I have a lot of contradictory experiences, like we all do, right? So I've had some mildly unexplainable experiences, but I've had a lot more very concrete experiences with both myself, my inner self, and with other people. But here's the dilemma. When we talked about science, I said, bridge to nowhere. You want to bridge science and religion? Forget it. Science isn't where you want to wind up. It's a bridge to nowhere. I would say the same thing with the history of this tradition, this Abriotic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. We're going to bridge that to where we have to go back and look at that story, at that history. I think it unravels, was maybe the wrong word. I think it falls apart. I don't know where the historical Jesus is. I look at Bart Ehrman, who I disagree with on a lot of points, but the main thrust of what he's saying is true. I particularly look at Joseph Atwell. I look at, what's his name? It escapes him right now. Eisenman, the guy who wrote the book on James, the brother of Jesus. I look at those biblical scholars and I say, hey, these people got it right. I don't care how many Harvard Divinity School apologists you want to stack up against them. It's clear, it's self-evident that the Bible isn't a reliable source for understanding who this character was and if he existed. And if the Bible isn't that source, then we don't have the source material. So I think that story can't be bridged because that story can't exist. It doesn't exist in a concrete way. But let me kind of get to the point, and this is going to take, I'm going to have to talk for another couple minutes here, so I appreciate you indulging me. But, when I came out of college, I really wanted to work. I had an MBA, and I had an undergraduate degree in information systems, computer science. And the firm I really wanted to work for was Arthur Andersen, the consulting firm. I wound up working for their major competitor, Price Waterhouse. It was a wonderful experience, but I really wanted to work for Arthur Andersen. Do you guys remember the name Arthur Andersen? Do you remember who that is, what that company was?
I can't say that I do. I do.
If you were in the business world, you would know that they were the largest accounting firm in the world. Yep. Thousands and thousands of employees, many million-dollar-a-year partners. That firm doesn't exist anymore because of a little company called Enron. And Arthur Andersen's inability to properly audit and their complicity in that scandal. Arthur Andersen was shut down. It doesn't exist. Thousands of people lost their job. Some of them were these fat cat $1 million a year partners, but a lot of them were just ordinary people, ordinary families. It doesn't matter. The collective good demanded that we shut it down. Can we do the same for Catholicism? Can we say, okay, there are many good things, there's many good ideas, let's pick up the pieces, post it on the internet, do whatever you want, but shut down these frickin' churches. You mentioned the ruthless nastiness. What about the just depravity, the horrible thing of isn't the sex scandal enough just to shut the whole thing down? I don't have to be anti-Christian. I'm not. I don't have to be anti-religion. I'm not. I just have to be pragmatic and say, we shut down the world's largest accounting firm. We can shut down Catholicism. We can say it shouldn't exist in the United States. It should be pushed out, we should sell those churches, whatever. We can find a way to do that. Will you join me in that call? I know I say that out again to provoke a conversation, but tell me what you think about that line of reasoning.
Well, I'm trying to digest all of that at the moment. I think that's a bold direction. I don't think the thought has ever crossed my mind to simply shut it all down. I think of, a tradition such as Hinduism, which is about 6,000 years old, probably. It extends into prehistory and, certainly has been responsible for a number of unsavory things in throughout history in the same way that Catholicism has. I think Catholicism is more in our recent memory. But I couldn't imagine suggesting, let's just shut it all down.
Why not, though? Why not? As a society, these are the kind of decisions we can make. I'm not trying to be the thought police and saying you can't privately practice or this and that, just like, accounting goes on.
That's the very reason for a third covenant. You're talking to a victim of the very crimes that you're bringing to the fore. I was not even deposed. They just wrote the check, because they knew how egregious what was done to me. And I think that actual experience might have been one of the triggers that got me searching for a third covenant, for something more real, because it was obvious to me as a child that this could not be what it was supposed to be, and the fact is it isn't. So what the Boston Globe called the greatest crime against children in the history of New England, you're talking to that crime directly, and you're talking to an 8-year experience of that crime in my own personhood. Would I shut it all down? I think if you'd asked me that in 2002, I probably would have said yes. But I think Ken Wilber is correct, is that the way to go is to transcend and then include, so that you leave behind the disease and you try to evolve in a direction that provides a product that is more benign and more in keeping with the teachings not only of Yeshua, but of the Buddha and of Krishna and of Lao Tzu and all of them, because they all agree on the sacredness of life, the sacredness of the animals, and the sacredness of our own forms, to the extent that we are generated by sacredness. We are sacredness incarnate. That's the real matter. Whether the historical Jesus exists or not is another futile duality. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we are incarnate. That's what matters, is that we're incarnate. We're in this form right now, and we transcend it, and we pre-exist it. So is it reincarnation? Who knows? It doesn't matter. Is it resurrection? Same thing. Who knows? It doesn't matter.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
The other piece that I think has to be included in this conversation is the question of context. In the 12 foundations that are presented in the book, which are 12 nuts and bolts ideas that sort of represent the culmination of my dad's work. It's the last piece that I touch upon in my section of the book. He actually describes context as a functioning part of our being. And when Thomas Berry broke down the, into 4 stages of the emergence of the cosmos, you have, the cosmos itself, you have the planet Earth, you have life, and then you have human culture. And each part of that emergence represents a level of our own context, and to remove any of them would impede on the full functioning of who we are as individuals. So in the same way that I believe every time a species is eliminated, we are impaired in our health and functioning, to remove a piece of our culture completely, wipe it off the map, as you're suggesting, I think would impede on the overall health and functioning of who we are, because it's been part of what has led us to this moment. We can't, I like to talk about the game Jenga, that we have this tower of blocks that represents who we are and the platform on which we stand in this moment, and to start pulling out, whether it's species or whether it's parts of our cultural, what we've built, all cultures. I'm not just talking about Christianity. And everything that's led us to this moment is to, in some way, degrade who we are now and where we're headed in the future. I think to transcend and include will always represent the better option.
And we have to remember that there are Buddhist pedophiles, and there are Hindu pedophiles, and there are Taoist pedophiles, and there are atheist pedophiles.
Of course.
Pedophilia is the problem. It's not necessarily the theology behind, the Christian experience. So again, I no longer, because of all of that, I no longer call myself Christian. I am a direct disciple of Yeshua, and in doing that, it's right there in the book. I study the Buddha, I study Lao Tzu, I study all of them, but I'm a disciple of Yeshua. Because why? Because there's an ecology of the soul. And the West, this is one of the points I wanted to emphasize, and I have to leave now, so I'm going to do it quickly, because I have to go to the doctor, like I told you. There's an ecology to the soul that as cultures evolve, they evolve with certain shapes. They evolve with artistic traditions, with literary traditions that are peculiar, and spiritual traditions that are peculiar to that particular culture. And the West, since my generation came on the board, the baby boomers, the West has been in a massive identity crisis, a collective substance abuse disorder that came about, I believe, because of untreated grief for the 2 Kennedys, and Martin Luther King and what that could have meant for our world, but also a massive identity crisis, looking to everywhere except home for the truth. So for me, the whole point in the journey is to gather as many different understandings as we can and then apply them to the Western viewpoint and change the madness simply by incarnating the truth, oneself. That's the third covenant. That's why it's emergent. That's why it's there. So this identity crisis, where I say it in the book in a comical way, I usually say that when I speak publicly, is Johnny the Presbyterian makes a poor Apache indeed, running around with bells and whistles and trying to identify with this culture or that culture. It's always a second language. Why don't we, if all things are equal, why don't we then try to redefine the Western world that is destroying the planet that all of us are trying to eat, drink, and breathe? And until that happens, the Western world will stay stuck in the morass it's in its collective addictions and its collective personality disorders and in its collective identity crisis. We have got to find out who the hell we are and be it. And that's the third covenant. And Alex, I would like to interview you sometime on your show. If you would ever want me to do that, I'm good at it, and I can push back that way.
You're welcome to anytime, Albert. I think that was a wonderful way to wrap up your contribution to this. Very well said. I love your point about the Navajo. We'll let you scoot on out of here, and good luck with the doctor. Maybe you'll find a good one. Thanks again so much for joining me, and let me chat with Rebecca a little bit further.
Sure. Go right ahead, and thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So, Rebecca, tell us what else folks are going to find in the Third Covenant. Let's go ahead and break it down kind of formally. The book is in 3 parts. Quickly take us through what they're going to experience as they go through the book.
Absolutely, yeah. I think this book is a wonderful way to introduce any reader to all 3 thinkers. I have met a number of people who have heard the name Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, or perhaps they've heard a famous quote, or they've come across a prayer, but they haven't had any chance to sort of dig into the meat and bones of what he was actually saying. And at the time, it was so controversial that he was silenced by the Roman Catholic Church. He never saw any of his own work published, and it wasn't until after the Second Vatican Council that suddenly his contribution was recognized for its importance, and it has since sort of trickled its way, but it hasn't ever been really integrated in a mainstream kind of way. And I think it's precisely because of the fracture between science and spirituality that we've touched upon throughout this interview. So the first part of the book provides a pretty comprehensive introduction to the cosmology and to the worldview that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin embraced and was writing about in his teaching. And he was, as we've mentioned, a scientist and a priest, and both languages of the divine, as he understood them, are present throughout his writing, and it makes him really a unique person. And Thomas Berry, who was one of the founders of the American Teilhard Association, continued that work in many ways, and he sort of brought it into culture and looked at, okay, how can we, in the same way that, de Chardin was trying to bridge science and spirituality, not even bridge, but sort of point out that there was never a fracture in the first place, that both are, if we shine a light through a prism and we see a rainbow on the other side, that the source is the same regardless of which color we're looking at, that in his understanding, science and spirituality had a common source and were uncovering the same essential truths. And Thomas Berry, his work was looking at the commonalities in culture, while he himself was grounded in his own Christian context. He studied and embraced all of these other cultures. So the second section of the book goes through in a very detailed way 12 principles for understanding the universe, which you'd have to read it, I guess, to understand. It's very difficult to sort of articulate briefly what's contained in those 12 principles because they are so comprehensive. But they look at who are we, and how do we relate to the environment in which we find ourselves in an interior and an exterior sort of a way. And so the second half of the book is really tremendous in bringing the reader through that 4-step evolution that I described earlier: the cosmos, the earth, life, and human culture. And so that's part 2 of the book. And as I mentioned earlier, part 3 was my attempt to take the various books that my dad has written and try to make them as easily accessible to the average reader as I could. And I hope that I accomplished that. And also to sort of begin to question and to begin to wonder out loud, where is this headed? What's next? And of course, those are questions that I wrestle with on a deeply personal level because being young and embarking on my own career, I take it very, very seriously and want to best serve the vision that is laid out in this book.
Well, as anyone who has listened to this interview will appreciate, you and your father are very bold and in a very positive way. And I really love that about the book. The Third Covenant doesn't pull any punches and doesn't look for any easy way out. It's very direct and very bold in a lot of its statements. So I thought that was great. I can highly recommend the book. I hope people do check it out. You can buy it on Amazon. I can't remember if I visited your website or not. Do we have a website that we can send people to?
We do. We have a website, but it is somewhat under construction. So, in fact, Monday afternoon, we are going to be putting the final touches on. It's a very basic website. It's really just a way to direct people on how to either contact us or to access the books if they want to buy the books.
Becky, I do want to thank you so much for engaging in this dialogue. I know I really pushed you guys in a lot of ways, but as I said in the beginning, there were just some of these burning questions, and I felt to a certain degree that I had two kindred souls that I could commiserate with about my frustrations about some of these things. In the context of, great. Well, in the context, of course, of exploring your wonderful new book, The Third Covenant. So again, thanks a lot for joining me on Skeptiko.
Thank you, Alex. This was great.
Thanks again to Albert and Rebecca for joining me today on Skeptiko. One question I tee up, I brought it up in the interview and in the intro, and that is, what are we to make of experience? You know, it's so interesting because on one hand, I feel like Skeptiko is waging this battle against science as we know it, who denies experience completely and says experience is an illusion. And on the other hand, when we jump over the chasm and are willing to explore experience and the reality of experience and even extended consciousness experiences beyond our body, we come back to the same problem that our very materialistic, reductionistic friends face, and that is, what the heck do you do with these experiences? How do you make sense of them? How do you pull them apart and turn them into something meaningful? How do we analyze them scientifically, if you will, and try and turn them into something that has meaning for us in terms of how we should live our lives, what decisions we should make. So what do you make of experience? What experience matters when we enter the spiritual realm? I know it's a question we've touched on before, so maybe the new spin on it is, what happens when this experience becomes very spiritual? How do we treat it then? So I'd love to get any thoughts you have on that. Of course, the place to do it is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com. From there, you can bounce on over to the forum and leave a comment there. Or if you like, you can leave a comment directly under the show notes of the website underneath the transcript. And you'll notice on those transcripts, John McGuire has done a nice job. We're kind of beefing those up. There's some nice photos there. It's a little more readable. We've highlighted some of the key points in the show, and overall it makes for a better, more than a transcript. It's really more like a little mini article about the interview. So if you haven't seen the website in a while, do check it out. And if you find it worthy, do share it, post, talk about it, do all that good stuff. So that's there. And of course, you can always contact me via email or Facebook and those links are on the website as well. So I have a number of interesting shows coming up, some really good ones in the hopper, and more just keep coming along. So there's no end in sight. We will probably stick to this every other week schedule that we really have always been on, but I'm sometimes tempted to ramp it up a little bit. But I really want to do some other stuff with the book, my book, which I have to say is doing really well, thanks to you and thanks to all your support. And people have written to me and said that they really like the book and they're really enjoying it and they're giving it to their friends. And I got to tell you, that's just amazing to me because so much of the book is about material that's been in the show that I sometimes wondered if people who are familiar with the show would really find the book useful, but they are. And I guess I did too. In the process of doing it, it kind of helped me bring back into focus some of the things that I've learned. So again, thanks for your interest and support in the book. And the point I was trying to make before I got sidetracked there is I want to do other interviews on other shows that are related to the book. I really, really enjoy that. And that was one of my main goals in writing the book, was to be able to reach out and connect with different people about some of this information that we've discovered here on Skeptiko. So I'm splitting time between those two things, and probably every other week on Skeptiko is about all we can do at this point. So if you do want to follow the interviews that I'm doing, you can check out whyscienceiswrong.com. Over there, I usually post the interviews coming up. As a matter of fact, I have one with Coast to Coast, which is a huge radio station, and that's going to be on Christmas night. I don't know when they'll get it up, but it's live, so it'll be up right away. So that's kind of exciting, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But I have some other ones on there that I'm equally excited about. I love the one that I did on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio with Miguel Connor. That was a lot of fun. I love doing the one with the guys at Grammarica and Mind Rolling, and I really had a lot of fun doing those interviews. So if you're interested, please go over to whyscienceiswrong.com and you can check out those other interviews and let me know what you think of those as well. So that's it. That's going to do it for this episode. Do stick around for all that's coming down the road. And until next time, take care and bye for now.